In 1342, papal investigators arrived at the palace of the Bishop of Winchester with a simple mission: routine inspection of church property. What they found instead would shake the foundations of medieval Christianity and expose a truth the church had been hiding for centuries. The bishop's residence wasn't just large. It was enormous, with dozens of rooms, private chambers, and an entire wing that seemed designed for domestic family life. Strange, considering bishops were supposed to be celibate servants of God. The investigators started asking questions. Who lived in all these rooms? Why were their children's toys scattered in the hallways? Why did the kitchen staff prepare meals for over 20 people daily? The bishop tried to deflect. These were orphans he was charitably housing, distant relatives fallen on hard times, wards of the church who needed shelter. But the investigators weren't stupid. They started talking to servants, examining records, interviewing the children themselves. And the truth came spilling out like water from a broken dam. The Bishop of Winchester had 17 children. 17, all illegitimate, all living under his roof, all supported by church funds that were supposed to go toward helping the poor and maintaining church properties. These weren't adopted orphans. These were his biological children, born to multiple women over the course of his 3 decades as bishop. But here's where it gets truly insane. The investigators weren't shocked because this was unusual. They were shocked because the bishop had been sloppy about hiding it. See, medieval bishops having children wasn't some rare scandal. It was practically standard operating procedure. What made this case notable was that he'd kept all 17 kids under one roof like some kind of medieval reality show. The papal records reveal something even more disturbing. The church had a name for these women who lived with supposedly celibate priests. They called them focarii, or hearthkeepers. It sounds innocent, domestic, almost respectable. But everyone knew what it really meant. These were official concubines, priests' wives in everything but name. And the church didn't just tolerate this arrangement. They profited from it. That's right. The same institution that preached about sexual purity and condemned fornication had created an entire tax system around priestly concubinage. If you were a priest who wanted to keep a woman, you paid a fee. An annual license, essentially, for the privilege of violating your vow of celibacy. Some dioceses called it cradle tax because every child a priest fathered meant more money for the bishop's coffers. The financial records from medieval dioceses tell the real story. In some regions, income from these concubine taxes made up 15 to 20% of a bishop's annual revenue. The church was literally running a pay-to-sin subscription service. Priests would hand over gold coins, get their receipt, and continue sleeping with their focarii without consequence. It was prostitution, with a religious middleman taking a cut. But wait, it gets worse. These arrangements weren't secret affairs that priests tried to hide. In many parishes, a priest's focaria would attend church services, sit in places of honor, and be treated with the respect normally given to a wife. Their children would be baptized, educated, and sometimes even appointed to church positions themselves. The hypocrisy was so normalized that nobody even pretended it was wrong anymore. One documented case from 1340s England describes a priest who openly introduced his focaria as his wife during a dinner with the local lord. When questioned about his vow of celibacy, the priest laughed and said that everyone knew celibacy was more of a suggestion than a rule. The Lord didn't report him. The bishop didn't punish him. Life went on as usual. Medieval church reformers occasionally tried to crack down on this behavior, issuing stern declarations that priests must give up their women or face consequences. But these reforms failed spectacularly because too many people in power were doing exactly the same thing. How could a bishop punish priests for keeping concubines when half his own income came from taxing those exact arrangements? The system was so entrenched that when church councils did try to enforce celibacy, priests would riot. In 1072, married priests in Paris literally attacked the papal legate who tried to separate them from their wives. They threw stones, set fires, and chased church officials out of the city. The reform attempt was abandoned. The priests kept their women. The bishops kept collecting their fees. But here's what makes the Bishop of Winchester's case particularly grotesque. His 17 children weren't living in poverty or shame. They were living in luxury, educated by private tutors, dressed in fine clothes, eating better than most nobles. Meanwhile, the actual poor people his church was supposed to help were starving in the streets outside his palace walls. Church charity funds that should have fed hungry families were instead paying for his children's music lessons and horseback riding instruction. When the papal investigation concluded, the bishop was quietly transferred to a smaller diocese, not defrocked, not excommunicated, not punished in any meaningful way, just moved somewhere less visible where he could continue his lifestyle with slightly more discretion. And those 17 children? They stayed in church care, eventually appointed to various positions within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The church took care of its own, even when its own were products of massive hypocrisy. The Winchester scandal should have been a wake-up call. It should have triggered massive reforms and honest conversations about clerical celibacy. Instead, it got buried in paperwork, explained away as an isolated incident, and quietly forgotten. Because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that the entire system was rotten from the inside out, and the men in power had too much to lose from that admission. What happened at Winchester wasn't exceptional. It was just exceptionally well documented. Across medieval Europe, bishops, priests, and abbots were living double lives, preaching purity while practicing exactly what they condemned. But the scandal of priestly concubines was just the surface level. What was happening inside the monasteries themselves made the Bishop of Winchester look almost innocent by comparison. If you thought priests keeping concubines was the worst of medieval church sexual corruption, you weren't paying attention. Because while bishops were collecting taxes on priests' mistresses, something far more sinister was happening behind monastery walls. Places that were supposed to be havens of prayer and contemplation had become something else entirely, something darker. In 1351, church investigators arrived at St. Leonard's Priory in Norfolk, following reports of irregularities. The abbot met them at the gate, nervous but cooperative. He offered them wine, showed them around the chapel, introduced them to some monks who seemed properly pious. Everything appeared normal, too normal. The investigators weren't convinced. They started examining the priory's financial records more carefully. The numbers didn't make sense. Food purchases for 50 monks, but only 30 monks in residence. Expensive fabric shipments to a monastery that supposedly wore simple wool robes. Regular payments to local women described only as laundresses, but totaling more than any legitimate laundry service would cost. And then there were the mysterious nighttime visitors recorded by the gatekeeper's log. The investigators decided to conduct surprise inspections at odd hours. What they discovered over the next few weeks would fill multiple reports sent directly to the Archbishop, each one more disturbing than the last. The monastery wasn't functioning as a religious institution. It was functioning as a brothel. Those laundresses weren't washing clothes. They were women from the nearby town who came to the monastery at night, were paid from church funds, and left before sunrise. Some of them came so regularly that they had their own rooms inside the monastery walls. But here's where it gets truly sick. Some of these women weren't prostitutes who chose this work. They were nuns from a nearby convent. The abbot had made an arrangement with the Mother Superior. His monks would make charitable donations to her convent, and in exchange, she would send sisters to provide comfort to the monks. Both religious leaders were essentially trafficking their own people to each other. The investigators interviewed the nuns privately. What they learned was worse than anyone imagined. These women weren't volunteers. They were ordered to comply by their Mother Superior under threat of punishment or expulsion from the convent. For many of them, the convent was the only home they had. Refusal meant homelessness and starvation. So they went, month after month, year after year. One nun, Sister Margaret, had been making these visits for 7 years. She was 19 when it started. By the time investigators spoke to her, she was 26 and had given birth 3 times. Each time, the babies were taken away immediately after birth. She never knew what happened to them. The investigators pressed harder. What happened to these babies? The monastery's records were suspiciously clean. No births registered, no infant deaths recorded, no children in residence. So where did they go? A younger monk, Brother Thomas, eventually broke under questioning. The babies were buried in the monastery garden, not in the official cemetery with proper Christian burial. Just buried, unmarked, in the vegetable beds behind the kitchen. Church investigators ordered excavations. They found the remains of at least 14 infants. St. Leonard's wasn't unique. Similar investigations at other monasteries across England revealed the same patterns. Monasteries in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Sussex all showed evidence of sexual activity, financial impropriety, and in several cases, infant remains buried on the grounds. The scope of the corruption was staggering. But wait, it gets worse. Some monasteries weren't even hiding it anymore. There are documented cases of abbots openly keeping mistresses inside monastery walls, introducing them to visitors as housekeepers, while everyone pretended not to notice the children who called the abbot father. Monks would go into nearby towns, visit taverns and brothels, and return to the monastery without consequence. One particularly grotesque case from Germany involved a monastery where monks had essentially turned their institution into a party house. They held feasts with local prostitutes, got drunk on communion wine, and used church funds to pay for everything. When the bishop finally intervened after years of complaints, he found the monastery's chapel hadn't been used for actual religious services in over a decade. They'd converted it into a dining hall. The church's response to these revelations was predictable and pathetic. Issue stern warnings. Transfer the worst offenders to different locations. Make examples of a few unlucky monks who got caught at the wrong time. But implement actual systematic reforms that would prevent this behavior? Never. Because too many powerful people were implicated. Here's a fact that will make your head spin. The same bishops who conducted these investigations and wrote outraged reports about monastic corruption were themselves keeping concubines and fathering children. They weren't investigating because they cared about morality. They were investigating because scandals that became too public threatened church authority and income. The ecclesiastical courts that tried cases of monastic sexual misconduct operated under rules that made conviction nearly impossible. Accusations required multiple witnesses willing to testify under oath. But who would testify against monks who controlled their town's spiritual life and often had connections to local nobility? The few cases that did go to trial usually ended with minimal punishment, a few months of penance, a fine, a transfer to another monastery where the cycle would continue. Medieval reformers within the church tried repeatedly to address these problems. They wrote treatises. They gave impassioned speeches at church councils. They proposed new rules for monastic oversight. And they were consistently ignored or undermined by the very people who should have supported them. Because fixing the problem would require admitting how deep the corruption went. And that admission would destroy the church's claim to moral authority. But here's the ultimate insult. While monks were abusing women and burying babies in monastery gardens, while abbots were embezzling funds to support brothel visits, the church was creating increasingly strict and bizarre rules about sexuality for ordinary people. Rules so detailed and invasive they made modern privacy violations look tame. And the people making these rules were the exact same people breaking them behind closed doors. While monks were running brothels and bishops were raising secret families, the medieval church was busy creating the most detailed, invasive, and absolutely insane rulebook about sex ever written. They called them penitentials, official manuals that priests used to determine exactly how much penance you owed for each sexual sin you committed. And these books got specific, disturbingly specific. The Penitential of Theodore, written in the 7th century but used throughout the medieval period, reads like a bizarre combination of a sex manual and a price list. It categorized every conceivable sexual act, assigned each one a sin rating, and prescribed exact punishments. Masturbation, 20 days of penance. Having sex with your wife during her period, 40 days. Having sex with your wife from behind, 3 years of penance. Yes, 3 years for a sexual position. But the church didn't stop at positions. They regulated when you could have sex. No sex on Sundays. That's the Lord's Day. No sex on Wednesdays or Fridays. Those were fast days. No sex during Lent, which lasted 40 days. No sex during Advent, another month gone. No sex during Pentecost. No sex on holy days, of which there were dozens throughout the year. No sex during your wife's period. No sex during pregnancy. No sex while breastfeeding, which could last 2 years or more. Do the math. Medieval married couples following church law could legitimately have sex maybe 70 to 90 days per year. The church had essentially outlawed sexuality for 3/4 of the calendar. And if you broke these rules, you owed penance. Days or weeks of fasting, public confession, monetary payments to the church, or all of the above. One penitential from 11th century France includes this actual rule. If a man has an erotic dream about his wife, he must do penance for 1 day. Not sex with his wife, a dream about his own wife. The church was literally trying to control people's unconscious thoughts and making them pay for their own dreams. But wait, it gets worse. The penitentials didn't just list sins. They included detailed questions that priests were supposed to ask during confession. Questions so explicit and invasive that modern therapists would consider them sexual harassment. Priests were instructed to ask married couples exactly what they did in bed, in what positions, how often, and whether they enjoyed it. Because apparently enjoying sex with your own spouse was suspicious. The questioning could get truly bizarre. Did you have sex while naked? That's a sin. You're supposed to keep your clothes on. Did you look at your spouse's genitals? Another sin. Did you touch your spouse anywhere other than what was strictly necessary for procreation? More sins. The church tried to turn marital sex into a joyless mechanical act, performed in complete darkness, with minimal physical contact. Some penitentials included penalties for unnatural acts that were defined so broadly they could mean almost anything. One 9th century text lists 37 different types of sexual deviance, including things like kissing too passionately, having sex while standing up, or having sex in the daytime. The medieval church was obsessed with categorizing and punishing sexual behavior in ways that make modern surveillance states look relaxed. Here's where the hypocrisy becomes truly staggering. These same priests who were interrogating married couples about their sex positions were the ones keeping concubines. These same bishops who were enforcing penance for married people having sex on Wednesdays were the ones fathering multiple children. The men creating and enforcing these rules were violating them constantly. But the church had an answer for that contradiction, and it's possibly the most cynical thing you'll hear. There was a concept in medieval theology called clerical privilege. Essentially, sins committed by clergy were considered less serious than sins committed by lay people because clergy were closer to God. A priest having sex with his concubine was, according to church doctrine, less sinful than a married couple having sex in the wrong position. The rule-makers had literally written themselves an exemption. The financial aspect of these penitentials was equally corrupt. Most sexual sins could be resolved by paying money to the church. Can't fast for 40 days because you had sex with your wife on Friday? Pay a fee and the sin is forgiven. Can't do 3 years of penance for that sexual position. Make a large donation and we'll reduce it to 3 months. The church had created a pay-to-sin economy where wealthy people could buy their way out of consequences, while poor people suffered the full punishment. Some dioceses got so dependent on income from sexual sin penalties that bishops would actually pressure priests to find more violations. There are records of priests being reprimanded for not collecting enough penance fees from their parishes. The implication was clear: interrogate people more aggressively, find more sins, extract more money. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew this was corrupt. Satirical poems and songs from the period mock priests who preach about sexual purity while sleeping with multiple women. Folk tales feature hypocritical monks who lecture about chastity and then sneak off to brothels. The disconnect between official church teaching and actual clergy behavior was so obvious that it became a standard joke. But jokes didn't change the system. People still had to confess. They still had to answer invasive questions. They still had to pay penance fees, because refusing to participate in the sacrament of confession meant excommunication, which meant social death in medieval society. The Church had created a system where they could extract intimate details about people's sex lives, shame them for normal behavior, and charge them money for forgiveness, all while the clergy themselves lived without restrictions. The psychological damage this caused is hard to overstate. Medieval people grew up believing that their natural sexual desires were evil, that intimacy with their own spouses was sinful unless performed exactly according to church regulations. That pleasure was suspect, that their bodies were sources of corruption. And all of this shame and guilt was being imposed by men who were themselves living in open violation of the very rules they enforced. One documented case from 1320s England shows just how far this madness went. A married couple confessed to their priest that they'd had sex twice in 1 week. The priest declared this excessive lust and assigned them both severe penance, weeks of fasting and public confession of their sin to the entire parish. The humiliation was so intense that the wife attempted suicide. Meanwhile, that same priest was sleeping with 2 different women in town and had fathered at least 1 child. He faced no consequences. The penitentials reveal something fundamental about medieval church power. Control over sexuality meant control over the most intimate, private aspects of human life. If the church could regulate what you did in your own bed with your own spouse, they could control everything. And by making normal sexual behavior sinful, they ensured a constant stream of confessions, penances, and payments. Sexual guilt was a renewable resource that the church mined for profit and power. But even this level of control wasn't enough. The church didn't just want to regulate sexuality through confession and penance, they wanted to profit from it more directly. And what they created was one of the most cynical business operations in history. A church-run prostitution empire that made modern organized crime look principled. Here's a fact that should make your head explode. The medieval Catholic Church, the same institution that wrote those detailed manuals about sexual sins, was running the largest prostitution operation in Europe. And they weren't doing it secretly. They weren't hiding it. This was official church business, documented in property records, tax ledgers, and legal documents. Let's start with the Bishop of Winchester again, because this guy shows up everywhere in medieval sexual corruption. In addition to his 17 children, the bishop owned property in Southwark, the red light district of medieval London. And by owned property, we mean he owned the brothels. Not indirectly through some complicated shell company arrangement. He directly owned the buildings where prostitutes worked, collected rent from brothel owners, and pocketed the profits. The prostitutes who worked in Southwark's brothels were even called Winchester geese, because they worked on the bishop's property. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't a scandal that got exposed. This was common knowledge. People knew the church owned the brothels. The bishop knew everyone knew. Nobody even pretended it was wrong. But Winchester wasn't unique. Across medieval Europe, church officials owned and profited from brothels. In Avignon, when the papal court was based there in the 14th century, the Pope's own representatives collected rent from dozens of brothels. In Toulouse, the bishop owned the municipal brothel and appointed its manager. In Strasbourg, church-owned properties housed most of the city's prostitution trade. The financial records tell the whole story. A 1347 accounting document from a London diocese lists income from properties in Southwark used for the accommodation of women of ill repute. The church accountants didn't even use euphemisms. They just straight-up recorded prostitution income alongside tithes and donations. It was a line item in the budget. Brothel rent, £45 sterling, right there in black and white. The church justified this arrangement with the most cynical logic imaginable. They claimed that prostitution was a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like rape, adultery, and homosexuality. By providing regulated prostitution, they argued, the church was actually serving society. And if they happened to make enormous profits while providing this service, well, that was just good stewardship of church resources. St. Augustine, one of the church's most important theologians, had actually written that prostitution served a useful social function. Medieval church leaders took this idea and ran with it straight to the bank. They created elaborate justifications for why owning brothels wasn't sinful but merely pragmatic. The prostitutes were the sinners, not the church officials collecting rent from their labor. But wait, it gets worse. The church didn't just passively collect rent. They actively regulated the prostitution industry. They issued licenses to brothel operators. They set rules for how prostitutes should dress, where they could work, and what prices they could charge. They taxed prostitutes' income. They created an entire regulatory framework that generated revenue at every level. In some cities, prostitutes had to pay an annual fee to the church for permission to work. In others, they paid a percentage of their earnings. Brothel owners paid licensing fees. Building owners paid property taxes. The church had created a pyramid scheme with sex workers at the bottom and bishops at the top, extracting money from every transaction. The regulations themselves reveal how deeply involved the church was in managing prostitution. A 1439 ordinance from a French diocese specifies that prostitutes must wear specific colored clothing to identify themselves, must live in designated areas, and must attend confession monthly. That last requirement is particularly twisted. Prostitutes had to regularly confess their sin to the same institution that was profiting from their work. Some church officials got creative about maximizing profits. In several Italian cities, bishops negotiated contracts with municipal governments to provide prostitution services during trade fairs and religious festivals. When merchants came to town, the church made sure there were enough prostitutes available and took a cut of the increased business. They were literally coordinating prostitution schedules around holy days. The most grotesque example comes from the Council of Constance in 1414 to 1418. This was a major church council where hundreds of bishops, cardinals, and other church officials gathered to address church reform and resolve theological disputes. The city of Constance had to accommodate all these holy men. So what did they do? They imported about 700 additional prostitutes to service the council attendees, and the church didn't object. They created demand, and local authorities supplied the product. Medieval chroniclers described the scene in Constance as absolute chaos. Prostitutes filled the streets. Brothels did unprecedented business. And all those church officials who'd gathered to discuss spiritual matters spent their evenings in the very establishments the church owned or licensed. The hypocrisy was so blatant that even people at the time commented on it with disgust. But here's the ultimate insult. While the church was running this prostitution empire, they were simultaneously prosecuting women for sexual immorality. Women caught in adultery could be publicly shamed, whipped, or branded. Women accused of promiscuity could be expelled from towns or forced into church-regulated prostitution. The same institution profiting from prostitution was punishing women for non-commercial sexual activity. The financial dependence on prostitution income became so severe that when religious reformers tried to shut down church-owned brothels, they faced massive resistance from church administrators. Closing the brothels would create budget shortfalls. How would they pay for building maintenance? How would they fund religious festivals? The practical arguments against reform always won because money talked louder than morality. One bishop in 15th century Germany actually wrote a letter defending church ownership of brothels. His argument: if the church didn't own them, then criminals would, and at least church management ensured some level of public order. He genuinely believed he was doing God's work by being a better pimp than the alternative. The system lasted for centuries because it served multiple purposes for church officials. It generated revenue. It gave them control over a major social institution. It provided services that many church officials themselves used. And it was so normalized that challenging it seemed ridiculous. This is just how things work. This is how they've always worked. Why change now? But while the church was running brothels and collecting prostitution taxes, they were still preaching about sexual purity to ordinary people, still interrogating married couples about their sex lives, still assigning penance for minor sexual infractions, still claiming moral authority on all matters of sexuality. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system was staggering. Medieval people saw the contradiction. They knew the church was profiting from the very behaviors it condemned. But what could they do? Complaining about church corruption could get you branded a heretic. Refusing to pay church fees could get you excommunicated. The system was designed to be unchangeable, with the church holding all the power and facing no accountability. But even this level of corruption and hypocrisy wasn't the worst of it. Because while the church was licensing prostitutes and collecting brothel rent, individual clergy members were committing acts that went far beyond financial exploitation. They were using their religious authority to commit systematic sexual abuse, and the church was actively protecting them from consequences. If everything you've heard so far made you sick, steel yourself. Because the financial corruption and institutional hypocrisy were just the framework for something far darker. Medieval church records reveal a systematic pattern of sexual abuse by clergy, and more horrifying still, a deliberate church policy of protecting the abusers and silencing their victims. In 1364, a complaint reached the Archbishop of Canterbury about Father William, a parish priest in rural Kent. Multiple families had reported that he was sexually abusing children in his congregation. The accusations were specific, consistent, and came from respectable families with no apparent motive to lie. The Archbishop launched an investigation. What happened next would become the standard church response to abuse allegations for centuries. Father William was quietly transferred to a different parish. No trial, no public acknowledgement of the accusations, no warning to his new congregation. Just moved him somewhere else where nobody knew about the complaints. Within 2 years, new accusations emerged from the new parish. Same pattern, same response, another transfer. Church records show Father William was transferred 5 times over a 15-year period, each time following abuse accusations. He finally died of natural causes in 1379, having never faced any meaningful consequences. And his case wasn't unusual. It was the system working exactly as designed. Medieval ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over clergy misconduct. This meant that when a priest was accused of a crime, including sexual abuse, he couldn't be tried in a secular court. Only church courts could judge him. And church courts operated under rules that made conviction nearly impossible and punishment minimal even when conviction occurred. First, the evidentiary standards were absurd. Multiple witnesses were required, but witnesses had to be adult men of good standing. Children's testimony didn't count. Women's testimony was given less weight. And anyone who'd ever been convicted of any crime, including minor infractions, was disqualified from testifying. The system was rigged from the start. Second, the penalties available to church courts were limited. They couldn't imprison clergy for long periods. They couldn't execute them. The harshest punishment was typically defrocking, removing the priest from his position. But even defrocking was rare because it required approval from higher church authorities, who were reluctant to publicly acknowledge that abuse was happening. So what actually happened to abusive priests? They were reassigned. They were given penances, fasting, prayer, monetary fines paid to the church. They were monitored by other clergy who were often friends or colleagues. And then they continued their ministry in new locations with new victims. But wait, it gets worse. Church authorities didn't just fail to punish abusers. They actively intimidated victims and their families into silence. Pursuing accusations against a priest could result in excommunication for the accuser. Making false accusations against clergy, and the church could declare any accusation false, was considered a serious sin that endangered your immortal soul. One documented case from 1390s France shows how this intimidation worked. A father reported that the local priest had abused his 13-year-old daughter. The bishop's response was to threaten the father with excommunication for slander unless he retracted his accusation and did public penance for lying about a servant of God. The father, facing social and spiritual destruction, recanted. The priest faced no investigation. Medieval people understood that accusing a priest meant putting yourself and your family at risk. You'd be branded a liar and a troublemaker. Other church officials would close ranks to protect their colleague. Your testimony would be dismissed or discredited. And even if by some miracle the accusation was taken seriously, the priest would just be moved somewhere else while you faced social consequences in your community. This created a perfect environment for predators. They had access to vulnerable people through their religious authority. They had protection from the institution. They had built-in mechanisms to silence victims. And they operated in a culture where questioning clergy was considered spiritually dangerous. It was systematic enablement on a massive scale. The Penitential of Bede, one of those sex sin manuals we discussed earlier, includes specific penances for clergy who commit sexual acts with children. Think about what that means. The church had seen this happen often enough that they created official procedures for handling it. And the procedures involved minor penances, not serious punishment. A priest who abused a child might be assigned a few months of fasting and prayer. That's it. Some church officials explicitly defended this light treatment. Their reasoning: priests were engaged in spiritual warfare against demonic temptation, and sometimes they lost battles. But removing them from ministry entirely would mean losing valuable servants of God. Better to correct them privately and allow them to continue their work. The victims didn't factor into this calculation at all. The financial aspect of church corruption made everything worse. Wealthy families could sometimes pressure church authorities to take action against abusive priests. They had connections, influence, money to pursue lengthy legal processes through church courts. But poor families, the majority of medieval people, had none of these resources. Their children were considered acceptable losses in the church's effort to protect its reputation and maintain clerical privilege. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention scandals that became too large to ignore. A monastery where multiple monks were abusing children. A bishop who was so flagrant in his predation that even other clergy couldn't pretend not to notice. These cases would result in some visible punishment, a public trial, a high-profile defrocking. But these were exceptions meant to prove that the system worked, while the daily reality was systematic protection of abusers. One particularly horrific example comes from a 1450s Italian city where a senior priest was finally brought to trial after decades of accusations. The trial records survive, and they're absolutely damning. Testimony from multiple families, evidence of abuse spanning 20 years. Clear documentation that church authorities had received complaints and done nothing. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? 3 years in a monastery doing penance, after which he could resume ministry. The victims' families were outraged. They'd expected execution or at least permanent removal from any position of authority. Instead, they watched the abuser receive what was essentially a spiritual retreat as punishment. Several families left the church entirely over this outcome, which was considered scandalous behavior that brought them more social consequences than the priest faced for his crimes. But while some abusers received even minimal punishment, many faced nothing at all. They continued their ministries until death, protected by an institution that valued its own reputation over the safety of children. And because church records were internal documents not available to the public, there was no way for communities to know if their new priest had been transferred because of abuse allegations. The scale of the cover-up became apparent during the Protestant Reformation when reformers gained access to some church archives. They found centuries of documentation showing the same patterns: accusations, transfers, more accusations, more transfers. The institutional rot went back generations, and the Catholic Church's response wasn't to admit the problem and implement reforms. It was to deny everything and attack the reformers as liars. What makes this especially disturbing is that church officials weren't ignorant about what was happening. They knew. The documentation proves they knew. They made conscious decisions to protect abusers rather than victims. They chose institutional preservation over moral responsibility. And they maintained this system for centuries because it served their interests to do so. Medieval victims of clerical abuse had nowhere to turn. The secular authorities couldn't intervene because of church jurisdiction. The church authorities wouldn't intervene because of institutional priorities. Victims were trapped in a system designed to silence them and protect their abusers. And that system was run by the same institution that claimed to be the ultimate moral authority on earth. But even this horror show of protected predators and silenced victims wasn't the end of the story, because eventually, the entire corrupt system reached a breaking point. When the Protestant Reformation finally came, it didn't just challenge church theology. It exposed the sexual corruption in ways that the Catholic Church could no longer contain or deny. And what reformers found when they started opening up church archives and episcopal residences made all the previous scandals look like minor footnotes. In 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he was primarily concerned with the church's sale of indulgences. But once that door of criticism opened, everything came flooding out. Within a decade, Protestant reformers across Europe were breaking into monasteries, seizing church records, and exposing sexual corruption on a scale that shocked even people who'd lived their entire lives knowing the church was corrupt. The monastery raids of the 1530s in England revealed things that seemed impossible even by medieval standards. When Henry VIII's commissioners began dissolving monasteries and seizing church property, they compiled inventories of what they found. And these inventories tell a story that's almost beyond belief. At the Abbey of St. Albans, one of the richest monasteries in England, commissioners found the abbot's private chambers filled with erotic artwork, sexually explicit manuscripts from ancient Rome, and a collection of what can only be described as medieval sex toys. The abbot had been living in luxury while his monks and the local poor suffered. But more than that, he'd assembled a private collection of pornography that would make a modern adult store look tame. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, commissioners discovered secret rooms behind the abbot's quarters. Inside these rooms were beds, expensive fabrics, and evidence of recent female occupation. The abbot had literally built hidden chambers where he could entertain women without the general monastery population knowing. Or so he thought. The monks all knew. They just couldn't do anything about it. But the most damning discoveries came from monastery record rooms. Church officials had kept meticulous documentation of everything, including things they probably should have burned. Financial records showing payments to prostitutes. Correspondence between abbots discussing how to handle pregnancy accusations. Legal documents about paternity disputes involving clergy. Lists of monks transferred due to moral irregularities, with details about what those irregularities actually were. One monastery in southern England had kept baptismal records that revealed at least 30 children born to nuns from that convent over a 40-year period. The records listed the fathers as unknown, but monks from the nearby monastery were somehow always available to help with financial support. The paper trail made the connection obvious to anyone bothering to look. When reformers published these findings, the public reaction was explosive. People had known the church was corrupt, but seeing the documented evidence was different. These weren't rumors or anti-clerical propaganda. These were the church's own records, written by church officials, proving everything critics had been saying for decades. In Germany, reformers opened the residence of the Bishop of Würzburg and found something that seemed designed to mock everything the church claimed to stand for. The bishop had maintained a harem. Not a secret mistress. Not a discreet relationship. An actual harem of multiple women living in his palace, supported by church funds, with children being raised openly as his offspring. When confronted, the bishop claimed he was providing Christian charity to these women. Nobody was buying it. The discoveries kept getting worse. In Switzerland, reformers found documents detailing the church tax system we discussed earlier, the fees priests paid to keep concubines. But they also found records of what happened to priests who couldn't afford the fees. They were prosecuted for fornication. The system wasn't about preventing sin. It was about generating revenue. If you could pay, your sin was overlooked. If you couldn't, you were punished. It was explicit pay to sin, documented in official church ledgers. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the autopsy records. Medieval monasteries and convents kept detailed death records, including some autopsy information for deaths that seemed suspicious. Reformers who examined these records found patterns that revealed hidden tragedies. Multiple nuns showed evidence of having given birth despite having entered convents as virgins. Young monks who died suddenly often showed signs of poisoning, suggesting they might have known too much about their superiors' activities. Children who died in monastery care showed injuries inconsistent with the reported causes of death. The records hinted at murders, cover-ups, and institutional violence on a scale that suggested this wasn't just corruption, it was organized criminal activity. One particularly grotesque discovery came from the exhumation of a monastery garden in Bavaria. Reformers, following up on rumors, excavated beneath what had been the herb garden. They found the remains of at least 40 infants, buried without markers or any indication of proper Christian burial. Some showed signs of trauma inconsistent with natural death. The monastery's explanation that these were stillbirths from local families seeking Christian burial collapsed when evidence showed the burials all occurred at night without any official documentation. The Catholic Church's response to these revelations was predictable: deny, deflect, attack the credibility of reformers. They claimed documents were forged. They said reformers were exaggerating. They argued that a few bad apples didn't represent the whole institution. But the evidence was overwhelming and continued to mount as more monasteries and church properties were investigated. In France, where the Catholic Church maintained stronger control, there were still explosive revelations. A 1542 investigation of a convent in Normandy revealed that the Mother Superior had been prostituting younger nuns to wealthy local men and keeping the proceeds. When the scandal broke, the church initially tried to suppress it. But too many people knew. The investigation forced them to remove the Mother Superior and implement new oversight rules that everyone knew would be ignored within a year. The most bitter irony came from examining church buildings themselves. Many cathedrals and churches built during the medieval period had been funded partially by prostitution revenue, concubine taxes, and penance fees extracted for sexual sins. The beautiful religious architecture that still stands across Europe was literally built with money from the very behaviors the church condemned. The stones themselves bore witness to the hypocrisy. By the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church was facing an existential crisis. The Protestant Reformation had succeeded partly because reformers could point to decades of documented sexual corruption. The Church's claim to moral authority was in ruins. Even Catholics who remained loyal to Rome acknowledged that massive reforms were necessary. The Council of Trent, which met periodically from 1545 to 1563, attempted to address some of these issues. They strengthened celibacy requirements for priests. They created new rules for monastery oversight. They reformed some of the financial practices that had enabled corruption. But notably, they didn't address the fundamental problem: the culture of institutional protection for abusive clergy and the systematic exploitation of power for sexual access. The reforms that did happen were too little, too late, and often poorly enforced. Old habits died hard. Even after Trent, there were documented cases of bishops keeping concubines, priests abusing their authority, and church officials protecting abusers. The system had been corrupt for so long that corruption was embedded in the institutional DNA. Perhaps the most damning evidence of how deeply the rot went comes from the fact that similar patterns of abuse and cover-up continued for centuries after the Reformation. The Catholic Church learned to be more discreet, to keep better control of damaging documents, to move abusers more carefully. But the fundamental dynamic, institutional protection of abusers, prioritization of church reputation over victim safety, use of religious authority to access and silence victims, that dynamic persisted. The medieval church's sexual corruption wasn't just a historical curiosity or an unfortunate chapter in an otherwise noble institution's history. It was a systematic, calculated, centuries-long operation that exploited some of the most vulnerable people in medieval society: children who trusted priests, women who had no other economic options, nuns who'd entered convents seeking spiritual life and found themselves trafficked, families who sought help from the church and instead found predators. And the men who ran this system weren't monsters in the sense of being psychological aberrations. They were rational actors operating within an institutional framework that rewarded corruption and punished accountability. They made deliberate choices to prioritize power money, and personal pleasure over the moral standards they claim to represent. They created mechanisms to protect themselves and perpetuate their access to victims. They built a machine designed to exploit and then covered it with religious language and claims of divine authority. The medieval church's sexual corruption reveals something important about power and accountability. When an institution claims ultimate moral authority, demands unquestioning obedience, and faces no external oversight, corruption isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The church created a system where clergy could commit almost any act and face minimal consequences, where victims had no recourse, and where institutional self-preservation always trumped justice. The bodies buried in monastery gardens, the nuns who died in childbirth in convents, the children abused by priests, the women exploited in church-owned brothels. These weren't unfortunate side effects of an otherwise holy institution. They were the direct results of deliberate institutional policies and practices. The church didn't just fail to prevent this suffering. They created the conditions that enabled it and actively protected those responsible. When the walls finally came down and the truth emerged, it didn't come from internal reform or moral awakening within the church. It came from external pressure, from reformers who'd had enough, from secular authorities who seized the opportunity to diminish church power. The Catholic Church had centuries to fix these problems from within, and consistently chose not to. Every internal investigation that resulted in a transfer instead of punishment, every accusation that was silenced instead of investigated, every abuser who was protected instead of prosecuted, these were choices made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The medieval church's sexual corruption wasn't darkness despite the light they claimed to carry. It was darkness enabled by that very claim to light. Because when you convince people that you speak for God, that questioning you is questioning God, that your authority comes from heaven itself, you can get away with almost anything. And for centuries they did.